This episode of Between Turns is brought to you by Between Turns, because Jeff is getting desperate and John does not read these before hitting record. What? No.
Okay, John, convince me house rules are good, because they're not. Seriously.
Oh, man. Well, first off, I think we both know there's no convincing you of anything.
Well, yeah, obviously. That's what gives me my charm, right?
You keep on mistaking the word charm for curse, but that's fine. Anyway, no.
Language is fluid, man. It's constantly evolving.
No, I was kind of surprised as we were getting ready to play Frostgrave, and I was taking you through the general overview of the game. I kind of pointed out a couple funny areas that I thought would be easy to house rule, just for not even for gameplay effect, but for comic effect. In every case, you just shrugged and went, "Oh yeah, that's fine," and that just surprised me because you're so vehemently opposed to house rules in general.
Well, I think it depends on the arena. I'm against house rules in standard Euro board games. The old Monopoly thing, right? That people, I don't like how this works, so they shoe in something new and it totally breaks the game. That's the house rule that I have a problem with. I don't like house rules that are slapped together after 2 plays. I don't like house rules that fundamentally change the way a game works. You know, I just, the downside of house rules to me are absolutely enormous. Because the problem, here's the primary problem. The games we play right now, this is the internet land. Like this is a place where it used to be you made a house rule and the only place a game was played was at your house with the same 4 people. It kind of didn't matter if you made a house rule that broke the game. If everybody was having fun with it, it was fine, and they would go the rest of their lives never knowing they were playing that game wrong. You know, it was just, that's just how it was. Now we kind of have this collective consciousness on the internet, and we also have, because of the situation where the industry is with, you know, the board gaming hobby no longer being the basement dwelling kind of thing that it was, whereas now it is very likely that at some point in my life I will end up playing a game of a democker with an actual German, right? Like this isn't it's not beyond the realms of possibility at this point. So the idea of just playing a game however I want causes a lot of problems, not necessarily for me, because I read the rules and I know what the rules are supposed to be, and I know the rules I change. And if I go into a new place, I can just reset that a little bit. But what about all the people that I've taught this to?
Yeah.
The problem is when they go out and they play somewhere else, they're going to have a miserable time because they're going to be playing wrong. Like they're suddenly going from a place of comfort to a place of, I don't know what's happening right now. The kickback from that down the line is that what you're building when you use house rules is it's a castle of deceit. Because you are essentially the nature of, oh man, the making a house rule for a game oftentimes is a case of someone going, this doesn't really work like it's supposed to, but I know how to fix it, so I'm just going to change the way this thing works. And the easiest way to change the way this thing works is to just not tell anybody that you even changed it. Because otherwise, there's a bunch of pushback as to why you changed it, how you should do it, a bunch of debate, we shouldn't do it this way, and all the stuff that goes with it. So what happens is you just don't tell the people that you're teaching that you've made this a house rule. And then they go out into the world and then they find that out and then they come home and then they come back over to your house and they're like, I don't believe anything you ever say because you told me this and you lied. And now everything you've ever taught me is probably a lie.
I fully agree with the whole breach of trust angle, right? That if I'm the one who's taking the responsibility of being the teacher at this particular game table, and I'm teaching a game that no one knows, I'm taking on the mantle of giving them knowledge, right? And if I amend that knowledge, or not even amend, but just alter the knowledge in a way that sort of suits my vision of the game, I feel like that's a breach of the trust that they've given to me by saying, please teach me this game, instead of going, hand me the rule book. So I'm totally with you on that part. Like, I mean, if you're going to house rule, I kind of feel like you don't. Let's back up. If you're in a house rule, you absolutely need to disclose it. But I would also say that if you're introducing someone to a game, you probably should leave those house rules out.
I mean, it's super specific, right? That whole little story I just told, that's kind of like one specific situation, you know? and that can be looked at too as, you know, well, that's what you get for lying, right? You know, that's a different morality play altogether than the issue of using a house rule. But I think I was just trying to demonstrate like one, you know, maybe one aspect, and there's many of these, many ways that you can use or learn a house rule and then march it out into the world and have it just smack you in the face. And that's what I don't like about house rules. There's a whole world of, or a whole angle about house rules that it's your game, do with it what you want, right? It's your sandbox, build what you want.
Yeah.
I agree with that in principle. You know, I think it's true. Like, you should do whatever makes you and your group happy, right? So on that end, I endorse the house rule. However, I think that on a personal standpoint, like from my own comfort zone, I treat my games like people treat their books. To me, the author's intent is important. And if the designer of a game, you know, if their rule set kind of sets up a way for a game to work, to say recreate a historical timeline, and then your house rule undercuts that, to me, I think you fundamentally changed what that game was trying to say.
Yeah.
And to me, that's less interesting. Again, just my personal comfort zone and my personal interaction with it. That isn't a reason not to use house rules. It's just the reason I don't like using house rules.
Man, I really like it when in making a point, you end up setting up the exact point that I want to make. Because one, it makes me look really smart. Two, it makes it look like we're having a conversation when really I'm just wanting to ignore you until I get the chance to monologue again.
Cool, go for it.
When I was driving home after the night that I kind of previewed Frostgrave, right, and I sort of teased a couple house rules, and you were like, yeah, sure. And I was expecting you to be like, no, we're playing it as written. I was driving home going, hang on, here's a conversation. I need to go ahead and think this through. Because my relationship, I guess we'll say, with the concept of house rules is very complex, right? I mean, because, as I said before, I totally agree with you in the whole betrayal aspect, right? I mean, especially nowadays when everyone is beating this drum saying, board games is a social activity. You can't then have this little caveat that says, however, if we're going to do this social activity and we're going to do it at my house and it's my game, we do it my way. Like, that's not a social, like, that's actually antisocial.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll go ahead and say it. House ruling in that particular mode of operation is antisocial. And even for that matter, if you get away with it and the people at your table are amenable to it, when they go and, just like you say, when they go out into the world and have gaming experiences with other people, you're now creating a problem for them and you're causing them to have an antisocial moment. And so at my games table, I don't ever want to sort of spawn these, you know, antisocial agents for that matter. And so I'm totally in agreement with you there. But the other 2 points that I sort of thought about are the exact two that you just touched on, and they're in opposition to one another. And the first one is that it's my game. I bought it. This is my game, and it lives at my house, and I typically play it with people that are my friends. And more often than not, it's people that are in my family. And so we sort of are coming together in the shared understanding. And while I log games on Board Game Geek, and I talk to fake internet people about board games and that kind of stuff, typically those experiences are had inside this real game space at my house in this enclosed environment. So it's mine. We can do whatever we as a group decide to want to do, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Some of the best gaming experiences that I've had have occurred because we have taken that initiative. I mean, you and I have had this discussion before about the legacy experience, about how making a campaign is about you, the players, making the experience. And that's largely kind of house ruling to a certain degree. And you as the players can take that ownership and take the impetus and do it yourself. And I think that's a great thing, and I think it's entirely magical, and I'm a huge proponent of it. Like, I love people modding their games, amending their games, and doing what they want to do to make the game enjoyable for them, instead of playing a game that they perceive to be meager and forcing themselves to play a game that they don't enjoy just because it's in the top 20 on BGG, instead of making the one tweak that would make it a top 20 game for them. You know, like, I mean, right. I have no problem with that. However, I'm also a designer, and I'm also an artist. And if someone walked into my shop and came over to something I was working on and just went, I appreciate the 6 months of work you put into this, but I really want it to be blue.
Right.
I would show them the door, and so I am a big believer in respecting the efforts of the hands that have created these things. I mean, designing a board game for a lot of the people that are designing the great games that are out there, specifically the ones that you were talking about, like the top tier Euros that function like tight clockwork mechanisms. Like they're balanced, beautiful equations that function perfectly, and they're tuned, and a lot of them have been play tested just ad nauseum by people that really understand what's going on with the game mechanically. And I appreciate that effort, and I want to respect it. And I've had great experiences where I've come into a game and played it 4 or 5 times and just thought to myself, I'm not getting it. There's a disconnect here. And then I've been able to play it in a different context, and suddenly there's the game. Like, oh my gosh, thank goodness I didn't throw the game out, I didn't set it on fire, and I didn't house rule it, right? Because there actually was a brilliant experience there, and I just was missing it. I've had enough of those to sort of hand the shut up juice to me, to give me pause to say, no, I actually respect what these guys do. However, it's also an industry, and there's also a lot of people pumping out these games that don't do all that effort and don't do all that playtesting. And so there always is that. I mean, we had an experience, typically, here at the house, we'll do like date night board gaming, and we'll play little 2-player games, and we played that game Cubo. It's basically like competitive Sudoku, really, is what it is. That's an oversimplification, but you're essentially taking dice, making an array of numbers, and then scoring points based on it. And the twist to it is that there's a floating batch of numbers, dice that you can grab from to sort of help make your little tableau in front of you. And we played the game, and we thought it was polite, and it was fine. And then we decided to play it again. But this time we house ruled it, where that floating pool of numbers, typically in the game, you can only grab it at the end of the turn. So that sort of signifies you're done making your array. And we house ruled it to where you could grab one of those numbers at any time and just swap a la carte what numbers you wanted to. Suddenly, this game that for us was polite, sure, it was competitive, but it just was a numbers game, and we played it, and it was fine. I mean, again, more people would have made it more chaotic and probably interesting. But doing it 2-player and being able to hot swap stuff like that made the game nuts, and we had a blast, and it was incredibly fun. That's one of those games that it's a queen game. I think I picked it up for $10, and it's just a bag full of dice, and that's all the game is. I don't think this game was play tested 150 times. I could be wrong, but I kind of doubt it. I think the game was intended to be sort of a light filler on the party sort of spectrum of things, and it fits that niche perfectly fine. If the game space is, okay, you need to have this enjoyable experience in the social setting of a party, yeah, you flip that rule around and it makes it more enjoyable in this particular party aspect. I don't think there's a problem with that.
Yeah, well, that's the can of worms right there. Is to interject my own kind of viewpoint on that. Is I agree. Like what makes it I don't want to say complicated issues. It's not complicated. It's just it doesn't really have an answer, right? It's one of those things that it is the user's discretion. So is MSG inherently a bad thing, or is it the user's discretion on if they just put it in all food? Right? It's that sort of thing. Like to get more specific on it, I can think of 3 or 4 games, I think, where the house rules are made with good intentions that have unintended ripple effects throughout the game. And a lot of those, sometimes those ripple effects, speaking generally, are just a different game, and that's fine. It's fine if a game changes, but it's still a good game. That can be fine. However, when those ripples go against designer intent, then I feel you're kind of, again, sabotaging the game that the designer made for you. To get more specific, just a couple off the top of my head. Kingsburg was a big one, and I don't know if you've ever played that, but it's kind of one of the first dice worker placement games where you chuck some dice and then you use those to place at spots on the board. And in that game, there was kind of this mechanic where at the end of every turn, these monsters would attack you. And the idea of the game was it's a castle builder. So you had to choose whether you were going to build kind of production buildings or military buildings. And when the monsters attacked you, the game itself would put up a random defense through a die roll. People hated that because it was impossible to plan around. So what ended up happening was they started introducing these house rules to make the castle defense number be predetermined and pre-specified. All the way to the point of they actually released an expansion that made that a module where you could actually, those house rules got turned into a module where people could have deterministic numbers instead of random numbers for the castle's defense. And all that seems fine, right? People that don't like randomness, people that do like randomness. But it fundamentally changed the game by erasing a strategy out of the game. And that strategy was to just have faith that the season would be good, that you had prayed enough at the cathedral, and the monsters simply wouldn't come this month. And the player that did that could score an incredible amount of points by not wasting money on their military. And that seems like a small difference, but what it did was essentially that was a primary strategy of the game. It was one of three paths to take. And by making those numbers predetermined, you eliminated the ability of a player to play the push your luck game. And an entire course of victory was removed from the game. So when a game has three or four equally viable paths to victory, and you remove one or two of them through a house rule, you haven't made the game better. You've made the game simpler, and that's not great, in my opinion.
Well, hang on. An example that is very similar that I'm reminded of is Quantum. I love that game, and I know that you don't necessarily like the game.
I don't not like it. I just think it's a game.
That's an accurate statement, sir. It is a game.
Yes, it's a game.
But no, I really adore Quantum. There are several reasons that I adore Quantum, but one of the biggest reasons that I fell in love with the game on the table was that in the game you're sort of developing your list of special powers, right? Everyone has the same actions they can take on their turns. You have the actions on your board that you can always take, and then you have your actions that are lodged in the numbers of your ships, which are dice, and you roll them, right? And so those vary based on what you roll. So there's the variance in the game. So each of us have access to both of those things, although the ship part of it will be different based on what each of us have rolled at that time. But then the game develops because we're each taking these powers that are giving ourselves additional actions. Well, the reason that's important, and the reason that's such a cool mechanic in that particular game, is because the game isn't decided on turn 1, 2, 3. The game is actually is decided on the last turn, and I know all games are technically decided on the last turn. I get that, but what I'm saying is, is that game is on rails.
Right. It's an important distinction.
And the game is designed to have everyone at the table, for the most part, especially when you're playing two-player, which is how I actually prefer to play the game. Like, you're designed to sort of go out there and flood the universe with your cubes of greatness, and the game isn't decided by cube 1, 2, or 3. It's decided by the last cube that gets dropped. And so the winning player is the player that can figure how to use their little box of tools in an exclusive way to get around the blockade that the other player has set up, that they, as players, are also setting up against their opponent. Like, it sounds like all games do that, and they do, but what's just so brilliant about the game is that we now will have this completely different box of tools to do this one head-to-head battle. And it is unbelievably cool and really brain-burning, and without fail, when one person finally breaks that stalemate and figures out how to drop that final cube, both people go, "Oh, that was amazing!" And it's awesome and cool. Well, the issue is that people were very frustrated about the game stalemating. Most people at least that, that were complaining about it online, were just going, oh, this game just goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and no one can ever win. And then, you scroll down and there's always 2 or 3 people in the forum that go, well, actually, had the person realized that they had this power, and they come up with ways that someone could have broken the stalemate. And then the sort of rebuttal is, yeah, but I mean, who's going to play the game that long until they can see that move? I would contend that that's the fun part of the game, is seeing that move and figuring it out. Well, enough people complained that the designer actually went back in and basically house rolled his own game, in that you could always drop a cube on any planet, even if you already had a cube there, which that was one of the limiting factors, but you just had to do an additional cost to get it there. Well, what that meant was, just like you said with Kingsburg, one of the chief strategies in Quantum is to look at the board, and it's not to figure out necessarily like how you can get a cube down every single turn. It's how do you get cubes down every single turn, but put them in locations that you won't be able to get later. And so you can end up building a wall sort of behind enemy lines and then circle back to your home planet, so that way dropping your final cube is really easy. And that whole strategy, this whole battle of wits of being able to see the game play out before you ever take your first turn, is gone if there's no limitation on placements. When the second edition came out, it actually was released with that in the rule book. That was just the way the game was now. There was no limitation on cube placement. And then people come back and they go, well, this game just seems silly. It seems like there's no challenge. And my response to that is yes, because the one thing that created tension and challenge is now gone. And that was, as you say, like at the behest of sort of a house ruling situation to deal with a perceived frustration in a group of people. And so, yeah, like, I mean, there's another example of sort of house ruling to detriment of the original design, I think. And there's probably countless more.
Yeah, I mean, one that comes to mind for me too is one that fits more the category of designer intent, about recreating a historical event, and that's Liberté by Martin Wallace. I having not done any research for the podcast, I'm a failure, so I don't remember what the sides are or anything. But the point is, he made this game that was, he designed it to model this revolution where there were 3 forces at work. And the game is interesting because the players aren't tied to any one of the factions. It's sort of like, for something you're familiar with, it's sort of like Pax Porfiriana.
About to say, it sounds a lot like Pax.
Yeah, where your loyalties are kind of evolve throughout the game, but they can be changed. And the point is that the way the game was set up was that you had these 3 factions, 2 of which would win 80% of the time, and the third faction would win 20% of the time. And that third faction winning 20% of the time was kind of the shoot the moon mechanic of this game. And it was interesting because it was a shoot the moon mechanic, which that's always kind of interesting in and of itself. But also, historically, that was a what if that was not likely, but certainly possible, again, making it pretty interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the mechanics of the game, it's kind of an area control game where you play a card and you get to place one of your influence spots in that area of a certain color, whichever faction you're joining. Part of the game was there's a market of cards you choose from. The market would lock sometimes. And people, that drove them nuts, that there would be nothing for them to buy that helped them, right? And it was a common complaint. Well, turns out that the market locking up was how that third faction won, right? I think that's what made them powerful, because when the market locked up, everyone's card draw was then blind. When the card draw was blind, that's when you could make those runs at that faction that only had a 20% chance of winning. And when that game went out of print, and this thing called the dagger variant appeared, which was a different way of using the market so that it didn't lock up. People tried that, and they loved it because they felt on their turns they had so much more room for decisions. They had so many different ways to get themselves out of situations they didn't want to be in, ways of swapping their loyalties and whatnot. So everybody loved it. Eventually, when the game came back into print, they reprinted it with that dagger variant as a standard rule. And again, the game plays fine with it. The game plays fantastic with that rule. Everybody loved it for a reason. But there's this little undercurrent of a problem, and that undercurrent of a problem is that 20% third faction win doesn't happen anymore. So the game is still being played, the interactions are still happening, and the player that navigates the three factions best still wins, but that shoot the moon mechanic is now kind of gone. And while the game plays fine and everyone is perfectly happy with it, for me, it makes me a little sad that this little nugget of history that was put in there super cleverly by the designer to make that happen has been removed. So this is another case of a house rule not being bad or fundamentally changing something, but it just makes me a little bit sad that I can't read the work in its original form and enjoy it for what it is. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no, I'm like I said, I'm totally with you. I mean, it's such a tricky thing, and I'm reminded there's a boat designer, I think is where this guy's from, if I'm not pulling this from the wrong way, but he had this great quote when he was talking about his design work, and he said something to the effect of like most people that do design work in their life want you to respect what they do, and they want you to kind of leave well enough alone and let them be the designers and trust them being the designer. And he was like, I am absolutely one of those people. However, there's a lot of you out there that just can't leave well enough alone. And if you're reading a book by a designer, you're probably a person who's interested in design. Therefore, you're probably one of those people who can't leave well enough alone. And he went, I'm also one of those people. And that's kind of the funny thing, right? I mean, like I made the comment about someone walking out there and looking at the piece of furniture I'm making and saying, no, you need to change everything you're doing, right? There's this part of me that just says, hang on, no. I've been doing this for a while. I know what I'm talking about. You need to trust me. Give it a year and you'll realize that I'm right. And not only am I right, but I'm also brilliant. Thank you. There's also a part of me that shrugs and just kind of goes, meh, whatever. You know, it's because I constantly get things and change them. We have very few pieces of furniture, in some cases even like from people I know, who I hope they never hear this, but like I'll get a piece of furniture and I bring it home, I'm like, I just don't like this one thing, and I'll change it. Because I'm one of those people. And so there's this fine line, right? And so I extend that courtesy to others, right? I mean, if I make something for someone, I give it to them. Well, it's now theirs. Sure, there's a part of me that goes, you should respect the amount of effort I put into this. But there's also a part of me that goes, man, it's yours. And the one game designer specifically, since we're here to talk about games, that this makes me think of is Vlada. Because in his rule books, which are some of the best rule books that are out there, they are well written in terms of clarity, right, but they're also entertaining. And they teach incredibly complex games in very simple ways. I mean, he does a brilliant job putting those things together. At some point, and I'm thinking about like some of his bigger, more complex games, right? He sort of introduces like mods to the game, or different modes of play, or in some cases just, you know, even modules that you can pop in and out if there's one part of the game that you enjoy or one part of the game you don't enjoy. But then he always puts in a little clause in there that goes, also, if something is frustrating to you, change it. It's your game.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorite designers. He's one of the designers I respect the most. And he's one of the people that I will go to bat for most consistently, saying, no, actually trust the design. Like, I get it. You play Tash Kalar and you don't understand what's going on. Play it 20 more times and you're going to think it's a brilliant design. Like, I will get on a soapbox on his behalf because I think he's done a great job and he's wonderful at his craft. However, he's published it. Like, he's published him saying, it's your game. Do what you want.
Yeah.
And of anyone who should actually have the right to say, nope, you're going to do it the way that I want you to do it because I'm talented, it should be him. But instead he turns to the camera and goes, it's your game. On one hand, it actually makes me want to play his games the way he designed them, because it means that he understands enough about gameplay to know what parts of it will and won't rub correctly, versus a designer that just goes, this is the best game ever made because I enjoyed making it, therefore you should enjoy playing it, and if you don't, you're an idiot. And there's some of those people out there.
Right.
I won't go naming names, but like there was one little game that came out. It was a card game, it was a duel game, and there actually was like a mechanical problem with this game, and it got brought to the designer, and he just told people that it didn't happen. And I don't mean like it didn't happen like you're misunderstanding the rules. Like he actually told them your game didn't go that way.
But that was a fascinating thread to read. I'm sure the pushback on that was non-existent.
It was just, no. It was just confusing because everyone's going like, wait, no, hang on, no. Like it was unbelievable. And it was like someone saying, man, like, I can't believe the sky's, green today. And then someone just looks at you and goes, man, yeah, I know. Isn't it weird that it's red? And you're like, no, it's green. I'm pointing at it. It's green. And they're like, yeah, I know, red, right? Like it was that level of just, are we all having some sort of mass delusion about this, that like, what's going on here? And that's all beside the point. But like, it's really funny because again, what sort of got us this conversation was Frostgrave. And Frostgrave, like, let's be clear, Frostgrave is not a Euro game.
Right.
Frostgrave is not even like a traditional Ameritrash game. Frostgrave is a rule set for a tabletop miniatures game. It's essentially like the rule set for a hobby game, a la Hordes or Warhammer or something like that.
Necromunda.
Yeah. But without the hobby part of it.
Right.
It's just a rule set, and it says in the book, use whatever minis you have. There are officially licensed ones, and they're they're cool, but it tells you like this is a rule set. It's meant to be a rule set. It's your game. So that's what we're talking about here. Most of these games, I mean, tabletop games in general. I mean, like there's a reason why when you go to tournament play for Warhammer, there has to be a ref, and it's because these games are. I will say that they're big enough in their extent that there are situations that the designer couldn't have conceived, but they're also loose enough in the rules that they want people to sort of come up with their own strategies and crazy methodologies, because that's the fun part, right? And then it's like any other tournament game. Like they put it out there, they let the players break it, and then they go, oh, that was amazing. You can't ever do it again. We're now banning those cards. We're banning that army. We're actually redoing all the stats. But they basically give you a new toolbox to go in there and break. And this is how these games operate. Well, so Frostgrave is kind of, it's in that same lineage of game.
Yeah.
Of just like, here's a box of tools, go have an adventure. And so in that game, I mean, well, hang on, let's back up even further. And that is, when both of us came into contact with this as a concept, I was excited because I wanted to relive the glory days of playing something like Mordheim. And you were excited because the concept was sort of pitched in a really exciting and evocative way, right?
Right.
And
yeah, I blame you, Joel Eddie factor.
yeah, I was about to say. I mean, it came straight from Eddie, right? So, but as we looked at it, we immediately chuckled and went, wait a minute, like, we don't want to play wizards in a fantasy world. This is Star Wars. Let's retheme it, and let's find ways to sort of make it fit in that universe, because that's what entertains us. And again, it's our game played on our collective table on our collective game night. We're taking the liberty to do what we want to do with it outside of the designer's original intent. But it doesn't, at least to me, and this is some of the curiosity that made me ask the question about house rules to you. And that's like, this doesn't feel disingenuous to me at all. And it doesn't feel like we're undermining the original game. It actually, to me, it almost feels like we're making it more exciting and more accessible. And hopefully we're going to come out of this as some of the great Frostgrave evangelists, because we're going to have a blast, And I think part of that is because this particular sector of gaming, tabletop gaming, and with a bit of sort of honestly, there's a bit of kind of it nudges on roleplay a little bit because the campaign is such a big part of it. Those two worlds of gaming, those two sectors of gaming, house ruling is built into the fabric of it. It's built into the fiber of it. It's like what we said about the legacy experience, and why that's so weird that this is being packaged as a box set is because it's a little bit disingenuous to have someone tell you how to do a campaign, because for the past 30 years, campaigns are what you and your friends make up on the fly.
Right.
And so this game is that. It's like, hey, we're going to give you a loose construct, go have an adventure. And it even tells you, like, if there's, like, all of these games, all of them, when you read the rule sets, there will be a clause in there that says, Inevitably, you will come to a situation where you and your opponent don't agree. And if you can't come to an agreement, you roll a die, let the die be the judge. And after the game, you talk about it again and decide what you want to do moving forward. To me, that's almost the chief defense that says house rules are okay in this game.
Right, yeah. I mean, I have two things to say kind of in regards to all that. The first thing is, clearly house rules can work and work well and actually be the preferred method of play. A big one, this is again, oldie but a goodie, but one that I don't know that the house ruling of it is large, but something that we've been doing for years. And that's like playing Carcassonne with a hand of tiles instead of just flipping the top deck. Mm-hmm. We have always played Carcassonne with like a hand of 3 tiles. That fundamentally changes that game. Mm-hmm. It makes it harder. It rewards the skill level of the players, because the players that kind of know how many of each tile are in the box have a huge advantage when you play that way. It lets you set up scoring opportunities 3 turns in advance. These are all things that are a fundamentally different game when applied to Carcassonne than the out-of-the-box thing where you just flip the top tile, agree as a group the best place to put it, and then decide if you want to put a scoring meeple on it or not. And when you play that way, it doesn't break the game, but it fundamentally changes the game and turns it from kind of a light, tactical, casual game into a really, really mean, aggressive, strategic, with still a actually bigger amount of tactical planning, not just tactical placement, and makes it into a completely different game. But it's a completely different game that has a whole ton of positive additions from that little mechanics change. And for people that want to play that way, it is amazing. So why would you, there's no reason to tell someone not to do it, right? Because it takes a light family game and turns it into a knife fight. So the point of all that is that it can work. So I'm not fundamentally against the concept of house rules. However, the second thing I have as a response to all the stuff you said is, I think where it actually all comes together, and this is probably going to fire up the elitist police, but I think the moral of this story for house rules is the don't try this at home kids thing, right? Yeah. Because I think when you tinker with a game, it's fine if you know what you're doing. And if you want to change a rule or patch a hole, that is also fine, assuming you have a near perfect understanding of how the thing works and how the mechanisms underneath everything that's happening work, about how the math works. Yeah. A lot of times when I walk into someone else's house rules, the thing that strikes me about them, aside from the fact that many of them come from groupthink, like you were talking about with Quantum, where it's not actually a problem, it's just people have groupthink themselves into being too lazy to find the solution. Yeah. Yeah. Aside from all that, a lot of times you'll walk into someone else's house rule, and if you're someone who plays a game kind of mathematically, or at least understands the mathematics underneath how a game works, you can instantly identify that the game is fundamentally broken or altered in a way that makes it one-dimensional, or that tips it in some unintended direction. And it's not hard to see. And I think this kind of point that I'm making is that my stance against house rules is because it's not against them implicitly. It's against people making them that don't understand what they're doing. You know what I mean? That it's, I'm trying to say this without sounding like an asshole. It's really hard. But it's to go back all the way to the beginning of this, where you were talking about, in my kind of example story about lying to your game group to get them to play a game your way. It circles back around to that, to kind of being a violation of trust to alter the mathematics of this game and serve it to your group. Knowing you set up half of them to fail because you've changed some fundamental thing about the game that you didn't even know you were doing, right? But that's the point, is I think it's house rules are fine as long as you have the experience level to do it. I don't trust that everyone does. Therefore, I don't trust the concept of house rules as being blanketly okay.
Yeah, I think I agree. No, because for example, going back to like the woodworking metaphor, as the person who makes the work, I would be significantly less offended if I knew the person who made the alteration understood what made the original choices in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that means they also have to be a woodworker. That understanding can come from context, right? Like maybe they've learned about it, or it can just come from them being an incredibly intelligent person that can see things and understand it out the get-go. But if I can trust that they understand, or if they can show me that they understand a knowledge of why the original decisions were made, and therefore a respect for those decisions having been made, then yeah, I'm fine with anyone changing it. That may be kind of what we're talking about here, because one thing that we've kind of peeked the door open on, but we haven't said outright, is that when we talk about board games, we're using this big umbrella term for a lot of very different objects, for a lot of very different experiences. We've seen all the fights that have sprung up around, what makes a game versus an experience. I mean, that's kind of the big one, right? Is game versus experience. But even just in terms of, in both of those categories, there are things that are called board games, but within each of those sort of subsets, there's things whose, we'll say, like where the game is different. It's like very specifically to the point. A Euro is fundamentally different in design and execution than what's typically called, an Ameritrash game. And both of those are fundamentally different than a traditional war game. And all three of those are fundamentally different from just a tabletop strategy game we're about to play with Frostgrave. And all four of those are fundamentally different than this, than that. And it goes on and on and on. And while I think that they're all part of a collective hobby, because we sort of tend to dabble into all these things, right? And they're all linked, and that's all perfectly fine. They're all coming from very different points of origin. And I think that is kind of that context and that understanding and that respect that we need to have before we start house ruling stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I've said it before, like, one of my favorite quotes is that it's the novice that exaggerates. And sometimes that exaggeration is actually an oversimplification. I think that sometimes by just going, oh yeah, I play board games, therefore I'm going to step into this type of game I've never played before and immediately go, I don't like this rule and I'm going to change it, is just a lack of context. That's the hook here, right? Is that it's not just, you have to be this many years of a veteran, but it's more, you kind of have to understand, again, like any number of things. Before you want to go and start trying to paint Impressionist art, you actually should go and understand what Impressionism is, not as a definition, but as a methodology. Same thing with Shaker furniture, like same thing with, for that matter, French pastry. Like whatever the creative thing is, the specific modalities of its operation are very, very specific and operate on fundamentally different premises. And I think board games are the same way. And that's that context. It's kind of, it pays to understand and respect before you go house rolling. So maybe that's that fine line that we haven't said.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can lay down a line, right? I think that's kind of a fool's errand to try to do that. For my own instance, just to give some kind of background as to how I actually approach it in my games in real life, not just philosophical discussions about it. But when I fundamentally change a game like that, I tell everyone that I'm doing it, like right up front, and I tell them why I'm doing it. And as you have talked about previously, the social contract of that and these people that are my friends, that we all have this understanding, they trust me and they're grateful that I said, hey, we're changing this just so you know, in case you go play this somewhere else. This isn't how it works. We're going to try it this way, and this is the reason why. And generally speaking, the game group will be like, that makes sense, let's try it. And then afterwards, we discuss whether it worked or it didn't work, and I think that's a way of adjusting that, or addressing that whole hubris thing. And I think being able to present it that way and have that conversation actually solves a lot of those problems, real or imagined, that we talked about.
Yeah. Well said.
Well, I mean, not to make this complicated or anything, but I think a good example of addressing the quote unquote house rule in a way that would be game group friendly is what we're talking about with Hyperborea, right?
Oh yeah.
Because Hyperborea, we all love it. Like, it's one of our favorite games. Like, everyone in the group adores it. And those faction rules, the faction tiles that give you the asymmetric powers, is one of the things that makes the game really cool. But it's also kind of fundamentally unsatisfying because they feel so unequal, and it's not just us that feel that way. I mean, if you go on Board Game Geek, like, the collective group think is that these tiles aren't balanced against each other, and they're definitely not balanced within the faction, meaning there's two to pick from, and one of them is inherently better than the other one, so the other one never gets played. And the house rule that I found and I presented to everybody in the group was that instead of using those at all, you just throw them back in the box and you draft essentially a power from the technology decks, and you all start with a different technology. And that creates a situation where you are playing a game with asymmetric powers, because at the start of the game, you all have a single different technology, and the technologies themselves are already point balanced by the nature of balancing with the rest of the game when they made the tech deck in the first place. And I presented that to the group, and to a person, everyone said, that sounds amazing. So now we're going to try that as a house rule and see if it works. And I'm positive it will, particularly because the designers said that's how the game worked in playtesting, and they changed it at the last minute.
Which is key.
So we kind of already know it works, but there's a situation where we're probably going to play that forevermore with a house rule. But we did the research, and we presented it to the group, and everybody said, sounds amazing, and we're going to try it. And if it ends up being amazing, we're going to use it.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, the only thing that we're losing at all is just this kind of nifty little thing they did design-wise, where each faction is kind of themed to be a certain thing. There's kind of a warrior race and or a science-based race, and the Rangers, and the color coding of the races matches the color coding of the actions, such that the green actions are the ones that give you movement and ranged attack, and the Rangers are green. And it's just kind of a cool thing where you can actually see parts of your sort of starting group on this tableau in front of you. So while you kind of have a boost to go in this direction, for example, if you're the Rangers, you can move a lot more. You're sort of aimed that way because of that starting power. Or let's back up. It's not even because you get a starting power that lets you do those things. It's because the starting power essentially buffs an action that's already on that tableau. It's kind of cool to see each faction represented on all tableaus, so that you can end up having a ranger that started out as a warrior if you really want to, but it's going to be a little more difficult, and that's kind of a cool thing. However, in this quote unquote house rule, we know that while we're kind of losing that clever little thing, we're not losing any game functionality. This came from the designer. It was tested out. What we're losing is just this sort of thematic overlay. So it kind of feels safe. It feels like it's on this side of the line of what's appropriate.
As a discussion point, I think we're talking big generalities, right? We're talking, are house rules bad in general? And I think that is no different than the argument of, are a lot of things bad in the general? Because, the answer is no, those things aren't fundamentally bad. House rules are not fundamentally bad. I don't dislike them because they're fundamentally bad. I dislike making it kind of positionally. I dislike making house rules are okay a kind of without being political about things. But no one wants to talk about that. But like looking at this from like say a political platform, are house rules bad inherently? No, they are incredibly useful. They have all sorts of applications where they work exactly as intended. They can enrich and improve a game experience. They can maybe change a game experience for people that don't like certain aspects of the game. I mean, there's a myriad of reasons. But I think it's my position on them, on house rules as a political platform, is I would say that it's dangerous to tell everyone to just go make house rules. Not literally dangerous, obviously, but I think that's kind of the scope of this. I think if you make the environment house rule friendly, then a lot of people that don't have the knowledge and don't have the expertise and don't have the understanding of what they're tinkering with start making house rules. And I think that kind of complicates all of this in regards to being able to talk about the game and be talking about the same thing, to be traveling to conventions for these games that want kind of a standardization so that you can travel to a convention across the country, sit down and play a game with 3 complete strangers, and you're all playing the same game because you're playing by the rules as written. And that allows you to do that amazing social thing that we all love board games for, where you can sit down with 4 strangers and not have to worry about small talk because you have this thing to focus on, but you are sitting there with those 4 people for 2 hours, and you naturally start having the conversations that are so enriching and that make the board gaming so fun and that are such a great part of it. And being able to do that, not sit down and then argue about which of the 46 versions of this game we're going to sit down and play, I just think it complicates life in the hobby for everyone involved, which is why I think house rules as a culture, like a cultural rule, are bad, while at the same time being able to say, for people that are experts at a game and know the game and can build a game, they're amazing. For people that fundamentally know they're never playing this particular game with anyone else except the 3 people they're playing with right now, and none of those people will ever again, they're fine. They're not hurting anyone. That's kind of where my position on that is, that house rules work. They're fine. However, don't do it unless you really know what you're doing, is kind of my final take on that. Or I'll send the board gaming police after you. We'll send you to Board Game Siberia and put you in the board game gulag.
Oh, I don't really know if I if I take the same kind of hard line with it. I mean, I'm absolutely fine with anyone for their own experience and their own game night with their own friends. I just make the game fun, right? I mean, that's why you're there. That's why you're playing these things to begin with, right? I mean, you're there to learn and you're there to have fun. But, the big thing for me is I just always want people to understand that anytime you modify something someone's worked on, whatever it is, you should do so with an air of humility, right? I mean, even the most seasoned gamer in the world, when it comes to a house rule, I mean, they should absolutely do it from the standpoint of understanding that, they're taking a written work that someone has put far more time and effort into creating than they're putting into modifying. And honestly, I mean, that's experts and novices alike. I mean, but both of them, regardless of level of, experience, you have to have that same humility that says the designers just might have been worth their salt. You could have a cool idea or concept that the game could teach. And that's, that's that whole learning part, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we play games. But the other part of this, and this is such a Mayberry way to say this, but I mean, the rule of thumb I use personally for house rules is if the origin of the modification is just a big goofy grin and a hearty laugh that just says, this would be amazing, then it's probably going to be a beneficial thing to do. And I myself am going to be taking the viewpoint that the house rule is fundamentally an addition rather than some sort of imperative that is now on every instance of playing that game. So that way, whenever I go somewhere else and they're playing, say Carcassonne, I'm not going to think, oh, you're playing the old way. Let me, give you the good news that you haven't heard yet. no, I'm going to be playing Carcassonne because, I mean, Carcassonne's Carcassonne. It's its own thing. And afterward, if the group seems amenable or excited by certain parts of the games that sort of, made my antenna go up, then I'd say, hey, have you tried this particular variant? But I guess it's funny that this point of origin of thinking about the house rules as sort of a next level style of addition, right? That grounds the game in being the game as published, right? Carcassonne as Carcassonne. I mean, that's the title, that's the experience. And so anything you're doing on top of it is on top of it, versus a point of origin for a house rule. And this is kind of what I consider to be non-beneficial house rules, right? This starts with someone just sort of harumphing and scowling and just going, I don't think this works. And just, having that know-it-all negative viewpoint of everything. And this is where that kind of TV land way to say this kind of comes in is if you start out your thinking by just going, oh my gosh, I just want to make this a little bit more fun for everyone. I want to make them laugh and be excited and think this is amazing. You're in a good place as an individual, and what you're doing will be an additive thing. It's going to be beneficial as a result, versus that scowling attitude that says, it's upon me to fix this broken game for everyone ever. When you do that, you've lost the humility and the real world context of how these things are made and how they're enjoyed. And you are completely reappropriating this activity for everyone that you end up affecting. And I think that is the part that's ultimately wrong.
Yeah, I actually think you're absolutely right on that. I think the presentation is everything, which is what you just said. I think that ruining your closing statement there.
You just can't let me have it.
Well, no, it's something I wanted to say earlier, and I was just gonna drop this and see if you could puzzle it back in somewhere a little bit earlier. Because I think you nailed that a little bit. I think the hubris of that is what you need to be aware of.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, that's just the core, right? But all right, now what?
All right, I'd just like to take a minute real quick to thank everyone for listening to Between Turns. If you feel up for it, you can go to iTunes, leave us a review. It'd be appreciated. You can also check us out on our Facebook page, Between Turns. Just do a quick search. And also over at Board Game Geek. We've got a blog running there and a guild. Great place if you guys want to leave comments on the show, tips, suggestions, cease and desist, whatever floats your boat. Stop on in. We'd love to hear from you.
It's just me here, right?